The desert night lay heavy, the silence broken by a single gunshot that echoed across the canyon walls like thunder rolling in hell. Dust stirred as John Mercer gripped his badge tighter, sweat cutting down his weathered face. John Mercer said, "Steel won't save me, not from what I carry inside." His revolver smoked in his trembling hand, and in the distance coyotes howled like spirits mourning the dead. The badge gleamed faintly in the moonlight, yet the man wearing it felt no honor, only guilt, as if every star etched on that metal cut into his soul. Shadows lengthened across the dirt road, where he stood alone, heart racing, haunted by sins that had no grave deep enough to hold them. He wanted justice, or maybe mercy, but neither came. Only silence stretched before him, and in that silence the memory of blood refused to fade. The night faded into dawn, yet John Mercer's shadow clung to him, heavier than the badge at his chest. The town stirred awake with creaking shutters and distant hooves, though no voice carried warmth. The narrator's voice lingered, heavy with sorrow, describing how Mercer carried sins carved into his bones. John Mercer said, "Every sunrise brings ghosts I can't bury." He tightened his revolver belt as if bracing for a storm only he could feel. The dust in the streets whispered rumors of his failures, and the faces of townsfolk seemed etched with judgment. To them, he was law, but to himself, a condemned man. His footsteps echoed through the empty main road, a man walking forward but trapped by the weight of his past, each step dragging chains invisible yet undeniable. The town's heartbeat quickened with whispers carried from porch to porch, the air heavy with fear. Shadows lengthened across saloon doors as men muttered over cheap whiskey. A boy ran barefoot down the street, his laughter cut short when he saw John Mercer's stare. The narrator spoke of a lawman who wore authority, but bore damnation. John Mercer said law means nothing when truth's been buried alive. His words carried more to himself than the crowd, but the silence afterward felt like judgment. A horse neighed restlessly, and the sheriff's office loomed, its walls no shelter from sins that clung like dust to the skin. Each glance from the townsfolk pierced him sharper than bullets, every eye seeing not justice, but a man slowly consumed by regret. Thomas Reed emerged eager, yet untested, his youthful face burning with determination. The man stood at Mercer's side, revolver holstered but his spirit unshaken. Thomas Reed said, "You can't fight shadows alone, John." Mercer's gaze hardened, his silence louder than denial. The narrator recalled how Reed's innocence clashed with Mercer's guilt, a bond forming between two men divided by years, but bound by unspoken need. Dust spun between their boots, as if the earth itself warned them. John Mercer muttered, "Hope's a dangerous thing out here." Thomas Reed grinned, despite the tension his youth undimmed. The town seemed to pause, its silence broken only by creaking wood and distant crows, the moment fragile like quiet before a storm destined to break. From the far end of town, boots struck the dirt with slow authority, each step echoing like a warning bell. Clayton Hayes loomed tall in polished attire, his badge gleaming too clean for honest work. His eyes, cold and sharp, carried both command and threat. The narrator described him as a man who believed power was his birthright. Clayton Hayes said, "Order ain't free, and it ain't kind, it belongs to those willing to take it." His voice cut through the town square, forcing men to bow heads and women to retreat indoors. John Mercer's jaw clenched, recognizing the venom behind authority, masked as law. The scene settled like storm clouds gathering the town, caught between two men, one broken, one corrupt, and neither able to walk away. John Mercer sat alone on the wooden steps of the sheriff's office as dawn burned into day, his eyes fixed on the badge in his palm. The narrator spoke of a man weighed down by sins that no morning light could cleanse. John Mercer said, "This iron star don't shine for me, it brands me." His words hung heavy in the air, spoken not to the town, but to ghosts that trailed his every step. The sound of distant hammering filled the silence as townsfolk rebuilt broken fences, yet none dared approach. Children peered from behind door frames, before being pulled away by cautious mothers. Mercer's shadow stretched long across the street, and though the sun rose, Its warmth failed to reach him. He remained cold inside, a prisoner of guilt, chained not by iron, but by memory. Behind the saloon, Samuel Cutter emerged from the shadows, his limp carried like a scar etched into time. The old mentor's presence was quiet yet commanding, his eyes reflecting years of regret. The narrator spoke of a man who had once lived by the gun, but now carried only the weight of memory. Samuel Cutter said, "Your past ain't chains, John, unless you keep dragging them." Mercer turned his head, but his silence betrayed the truth. The old man placed a hand on the weathered doorframe, his knuckles scarred from battles long buried. Together, they stood like statues at the edge of a world that no longer belonged to them. The town bustled faintly beyond, yet between them lingered the ache of men who had seen too much blood spilled. From the saloon doors stepped Elena Marlowe, her elegance foreign to the dust that clung to every board of the town. Her dress of deep crimson contrasted with her hardened gaze, beauty tempered by secrets. The narrator described her as a flame both alluring and dangerous. Elena Marlowe said, "You hide behind that badge, John, but it can't hide you." Mercer's jaw tightened though his words did not rise. Whispers spread across the street as eyes followed her measured stride, every step stirring tension like sparks near dry timber. For all her poise, her smile flickered with sorrow, a mask unable to conceal the storm within. Between her and Mercer hung a history untold, a thread of mistrust and temptation woven into silence. Sheriff Clayton Hayes stood at the courthouse steps, his polished boots gleaming against dust that dared not touch him. His voice carried over the crowd with the weight of law twisted into power. Clayton Hayes said, "There's no place for weakness in this town, not while I wear this badge." The narrator spoke of a man who turned authority into a weapon, sharper than any blade. The townsfolk listened in silence, fear etched across their faces. John Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd, his badge dull compared to Hayes' gleam, a contrast of corruption and guilt. The courthouse bell tolled, its sound rolling heavy across the square, sealing Hayes' authority like a brand upon every soul. Thomas Reed followed close behind Mercer as they walked down the main road, his youthful stride eager, his eyes still shining with unbroken hope. The narrator spoke of a boy chasing shadows, too eager to see the darkness for what it was. Thomas Reed said, "One day they'll see you as I do, John, a man who still fights for what's right." Mercer's voice came low, filled with sorrow. John Mercer said, "You'll learn this world don't pay men for being right, only for surviving." Dust swirled around them as townsfolk watched in silence, one man scarred by years of regret, the other untouched by its weight. Together they formed a fragile balance, youth refusing to give up, age too tired to keep fighting. Sheriff Clayton Hayes walked into the saloon, his badge gleaming like a predator's smile. The narrator spoke of corruption laid bare, a man who wore law but lived by greed. Clayton Hayes said, "This town pays tribute in silence or in blood." His deputies laughed coldly as they shoved a rancher to the ground, coins spilling from his pocket. John Mercer stood in the doorway, his tarnished badge a hollow echo of the sheriff's polished star. The two men's eyes locked across the smoky room, one hardened by arrogance, the other by guilt. The piano ceased, and silence filled the saloon like a storm pressing down. The air thickened with dread, every soul inside knowing justice had no place here. Hayes had revealed himself, and in that revelation, the town trembled. The gunshot had not yet fired, but blood was already spilled in John Mercer's mind. He watched helplessly as a farmer begged Hayes for mercy, his pleas drowned by the sheriff's cruel grin. The narrator spoke of a man sworn to protect, yet chained by fear of his own past. John Mercer said, "I failed once, and death followed. If I fail again, it will swallow us all." His grip on the revolver belt tightened, yet his boots remained planted. The crowd shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the two lawmen. Hayes thrived on that fear, his smirk broadening as he turned his back on the man he had humiliated. Mercer's silence cut deeper than any blade, for every second he delayed, his guilt grew heavier, and his enemies stronger. Elena Marlowe lingered near the stairwell, her crimson dress glowing faintly in the dim light. The narrator spoke of a woman tied by loyalty and betrayal, her silence louder than truth. Clayton Hayes whispered near her ear, his presence laced with control. Elena Marlowe said, "Some debts can't be paid, only carried." Her eyes betrayed conflict, flickering toward Mercer before turning away. The room felt colder, as if betrayal itself had entered with her. Whispers spread across the saloon, suspicion blooming like fire on dry grass. Mercer's jaw tightened, his hand hovering near his revolver, but his heart knew she was both his weakness and his warning. In that moment, loyalty was no longer certain, and every bond seemed built on sand. Thomas Reed rushed in, his youth burning against the suffocating dread. The narrator spoke of innocence untested, now thrown into a storm of corruption and sin. Thomas Reed said, "You can't just stand there, John. Thou'll eat this town alive." His voice cracked with anger, yet his eyes still gleamed with hope. John Mercer looked down, the weight of his past shackling him in silence. The boy's frustration lit the room brighter than the lanterns, his defiance a spark Mercer had long since lost. Hayes sneered, dismissing him with a wave, as if youth itself were worthless. The saloon air grew heavy with the clash of ideals, one weary, one unbroken, and for the first time, Mercer feared not the enemy, but the truth of what he had become. At the edge of the saloon, Samuel Cutter's voice broke the silence like an old hymn carried by regret. Samuel Cutter said, "Every man who rides with vengeance finds the grave waiting sooner." The narrator spoke of wisdom carved from scars, a warning few wished to hear. Mercer raised his eyes, haunted yet searching, while Reed clenched his fists in defiance. Hayes laughed, the sound sharp as glass, mocking the frailty of men who spoke of honor. The crowd shifted, drawn into the storm of words that weighed heavier than bullets. In that moment, the saloon became a courtroom of souls, where guilt, youth, wisdom, and corruption all stood trial. And yet, the verdict remained unwritten, hanging in the smoky air like a noose waiting to fall. Gunfire cracked across the dusty streets, as Clayton Hayes tightened his grip on the town. The narrator spoke of power spreading like a plague, burning through fear and silence. Men loyal to Hayes stormed the general store, dragging out a merchant while his wife screamed. John Mercer stood at the corner, fists clenched, torn between action and the chains of guilt. John Mercer said, "Every man I failed, I carry still." His voice drowned under the chaos as shots rang out, shutters slammed, and children cried. Hayes's deputies strutted down the street, their polished boots crushing dust like victory. The town was no longer theirs. It belonged to the law twisted into tyranny. Every shadow whispered rebellion, yet none dared to rise. Inside the dim saloon, Elena Marlowe cornered Mercer, her words sharp as broken glass. Elena Marlowe said, "If you stand still, John, you'll lose more than this town." The narrator spoke of a woman torn between survival and conscience, her loyalties shifting like sand in the wind. Her eyes held fire but also fear, her hand clutching a letter she refused to reveal. John Mercer said, "Secrets kill faster than bullets, Elena." His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of trust he could not give. Her crimson dress shimmered under lantern glow, as her lips curled into a smile hiding sorrow. Their shadows stretched across the wall, entwined but jagged, a mirror of bonds fraying under betrayal. Thomas Reed stormed into the street, revolver shaking in his unsteady hand, his youth bristling with defiance. The narrator spoke of innocence shattered too soon, courage thrown against a storm too great. Thomas Reed shouted, "You can't choke us forever, Hayes." His words rang louder than his trembling. The crowd gasped, watching a boy try to fill a man's boots. Hayes' deputies sneered, their fingers resting on triggers, ready to crush his spirit. Mercer's heart pounded, fear not for himself, but for the boy who stood in his place. Dust swirled around them as silence pressed heavy, every second dragging like an eternity. Reed's fire was real, but it was fragile, and fragile things broke under boots of men like Hayes. Clayton Hayes stepped forward, his shadow falling over Mercer like a gallows rope. The narrator spoke of truth sharpened into a weapon, a man's sins turned against him. Clayton Hayes said, "You wear guilt like a cloak, Mercer. I'll tear it off and show them the killer you are." Mercer's jaw clenched, the weight of his past pressing harder than the badge at his chest. Townsfolk whispered, fear blending with doubt, their eyes narrowing on the man they once called protector. Hayes's grin widened, every word a noose around Mercer's neck. The courthouse bell tolled again, not for order, but for judgment. The echo carried through the square, and in its sound, Mercer heard the promise of his ruin. That night, rain began to fall, washing dust into mud as Mercer knelt over a grave at the edge of town. The narrator spoke of loss, the kind that cut deeper than bullets. "John Mercer," said, "every name carved here is mine to bear." His voice broke in the storm, grief hollowing him further. A crude wooden cross stood above the grave of a boy gunned down in the chaos, his laughter silenced forever. Thomas Reed watched from a distance, his eyes burning with a fire that innocence had lost. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating a man broken, kneeling not just for the dead, but for the weight of his own soul. The rain did not cleanse him. It only carved his sins deeper. John Mercer stood in the abandoned church, moonlight streaming through broken glass like judgment. The narrator spoke of secrets that rot beneath silence, until they burst into truth. Mercer unwrapped a blood-stained letter hidden for years. His hands trembled as the words revealed his own sins, that he had killed a man once thought to be innocent, a man tied to the townsfolk now suffering under Hayes. John Mercer said, "This badge ain't justice, it's a coffin I nailed shut myself." His voice cracked in the hollow silence. Outside, thunder rolled, as if heaven itself condemned him. The truth burned hotter than fire, his guilt no longer whispered, but screamed in every word etched on that page. Samuel Cutter entered the church, his limp echoing against the hollow boards. The narrator spoke of an old man carrying his own sins, yet tonight his words cut deeper. Samuel Cutter said, "You didn't kill a stranger, John. You killed my brother." The revelation struck harder than any bullet, the air thick with grief and betrayal. John Mercer staggered, his breath heavy, as if the walls pressed inward. Samuel's eyes burned with both rage and sorrow, the kind only family blood can ignite. Silence held them prisoner, each man facing a wound too deep for healing. The storm outside grew violent, lightning flashing through the broken window as two lives fractured forever inside that ruined church. Elena Marlowe emerged from the shadows, her crimson dress torn by rain and dirt, her face hardened by secrets she no longer wished to hide. The narrator spoke of betrayal unveiled in blood and fire. Elena Marlowe said, "Hayes owns me because I carry your secret too, John. I helped bury that body." Her confession cracked the fragile line between ally and enemy. Mercer's face paled as the truth unraveled, every bond twisting into chains. The room spun with deceit, its silence louder than thunder. Elena's eyes, once veiled with allure, now glistened with tears she could not stop. For Mercer, there was no one left untouched by his sins, not even the woman he once thought might save him. Thomas Reed burst into the church, his revolver drawn, his youthful face carved with fury. The narrator spoke of innocence shattered by truth, a boy now forced to confront a man he once idolized. Thomas Reed said, "You told me to fight for justice, John, but you've been hiding behind lies." His voice shook, yet it carried louder than thunder. Mercer looked upon him with hollow eyes, the weight of guilt crushing him silent. Samuel Cutter turned away, unable to watch the boy's faith collapse. Elena's tears fell quietly into the dust. Reed's revolver shook in his hand, not from fear, but from the war inside his heart, between vengeance and the last flicker of loyalty he still clung to. Clayton Hayes entered last, rain dripping from his polished coat, his grin cutting through the ruin like a blade. The narrator spoke of triumph forged in corruption, a villain who thrived on others' sins. Clayton Hayes said, "I never had to break you, Mercer. You broke yourself, and I just let the pieces fall." His deputies fanned out behind him, rifles gleaming in lantern light. Mercer stood surrounded, his allies broken by revelation, his enemies emboldened by his ruin. Lightning split the sky as Hayes' laughter filled the church. In that instant, Mercer understood. This was no battle for law, but for the soul of a man torn between redemption and destruction. The noose was tightening, and every truth had placed it there. The storm passed but left the town drowning in silence. John Mercer walked through the mud-soaked street, each step heavier than the last. The narrator spoke of a man preparing for judgment, not by law, but by blood. John Mercer said, "If this ends, it ends with me." His hand rested on his revolver, though his eyes showed no hunger for vengeance, only the weariness of a man who no longer feared death. Thomas Reed followed close behind, his face still torn between rage and faith. The townsfolk watched from their porches, whispering prayers that felt too small. Clouds broke above, letting pale sunlight fall upon the street like a spotlight over a stage built for ruin. Clayton Hayes stood tall in the square, deputies fanned around him like wolves circling prey. The narrator spoke of arrogance forged in unchecked power, a man certain of victory. Clayton Hayes said, "You wanted justice, Mercer. Here it is, yours or mine." His words rang like a death knell, and the crowd gasped. Mercer stepped forward, his badge catching faint sunlight but no honor. His voice low, steady, he replied, "This ends today, Clayton, one way or another." The square held its breath, silence cutting sharper than any blade. Even the wind seemed to falter as two men, once bound by law, now stood as mortal enemies destined for blood. The first shot shattered the silence, Hayes' deputy falling in the mud with blood soaking into the earth. The narrator spoke of chaos birthed from pride, a storm of bullets swallowing mercy. Gunfire erupted, the air thick with smoke and screams. John Mercer dove behind a trough, his revolver barking in return. Thomas Reed fired wildly, fear in his eyes, but courage in his stance. Clayton Hayes stood firm, his cold grin unbroken as he ordered, "Kill them all." The square became a battlefield, dust and blood mixing under the harsh sun. No law, no justice remained, only survival sharpened to a razor's edge. Samuel Cutter staggered into the square, his limp dragging through the mud, his eyes blazing with one last fire. The narrator spoke of sacrifice carved from regret, a man paying debts he could never settle. Samuel Cutter shouted, "You'll take me before you take him." His revolver roared, felling two deputies before a bullet struck his chest. Blood spread across his shirt as he fell to his knees, yet his eyes never wavered. Mercer cried out, his voice breaking, "No!" Hayes sneered, unfazed, stepping forward like a vulture circling the dying. Cutter's sacrifice was not enough to end the storm, but it lit a spark in Mercer's soul that despair could not smother. The square fell into silence again, smoke curling above the dead. John Mercer stood in the open, revolver leveled at Hayes, his eyes hollow yet unyielding. The narrator spoke of reckoning, the soul stripped bare at its final trial. Hayes raised his own gun, sneering, "You'll die the coward you always were." Mercer's voice came steady, no longer broken. John Mercer said, "Not today." Their guns fired as one, thunder splitting the square. Hayes staggered, clutching his chest as blood darkened his polished coat. Mercer stood wounded but unfallen, his badge bent and bloodied. Around them, the town stared in silence, witnesses to the end of one man's tyranny and another man's torment. The gun smoke settled over the square like a funeral shroud. Clayton Hayes lay sprawled in the mud, his polished badge buried beneath blood. The narrator spoke of silence, the kind that followed storms when nothing felt whole. John Mercer stood trembling, blood seeping from his side, his revolver hanging loose. Townsfolk emerged slowly, their eyes filled not with cheers, but with fear of what remained. Mercer's shoulders sagged under the weight of victory that felt like loss. John Mercer said, "This was never justice, only survival." The courthouse bell rang in the distance, its hollow toll sounding more like mourning than triumph. Thomas Reed walked through the square, his revolver still shaking in his hand, though the battle was done. The narrator spoke of innocence stripped bare, a boy forced into manhood by blood, His eyes lingered on Mercer, no longer filled with worship, but with weary understanding. Thomas Reed said, "If this is justice, I don't want it." His voice cracked, carrying both pain and truth. He dropped his revolver into the mud, letting it sink like the last of his youth. Mercer looked at him, eyes hollow, knowing he had passed his curse to the boy. The square echoed with silence, heavier than the storm that had broken it. Elena Marlowe stood at the church steps, her crimson dress soaked in rain and dirt, her eyes hollowed by choices she could not undo. The narrator spoke of loyalty and betrayal intertwined, a woman bound by both love and regret. Elena Marlowe said, "There are no victors, only survivors." Her voice was soft, almost a confession. She glanced at Mercer, tears glistening on her cheeks before she turned away, vanishing into the night without another word. The crowd parted for her like shadows fleeing the dawn, each step echoing like the fading notes of a song no one would sing again. At the edge of the graveyard, Samuel Cutter's body was laid to rest beneath a wooden cross, the ground still wet with storm rain. The narrator spoke of sacrifice paid in silence, a man's final act outliving his regrets. John Mercer knelt in the mud, his hand pressed against the damp earth. John Mercer said, "You gave me a chance I never earned." His voice broke, heavy with sorrow. Thomas Reed stood behind him, hat in hand, his young face carved with grief and new resolve. The townsfolk gathered in silence, the sound of the wind carrying over the hills like a hymn. The moment was not triumph, but farewell. Night fell over the town, stars breaking through the clouds as John Mercer walked alone down the empty street. The narrator spoke of a man who had faced his reckoning, yet found no redemption, only the weight of survival. His badge hung broken at his side, bent and bloodied, catching the faint silver light. John Mercer said, "This badge don't save souls, it only marks the damned." His voice drifted into the night as he stepped into shadow. The final lanterns flickered out, leaving only silence and the memory of a man torn between justice and sin. The town would never forget him, nor would he ever escape himself.